Victoria Monroe stood at the podium accepting her Architect of the Year award, the crystal trophy gleaming under the spotlight, when her husband Marcus served her divorce papers in front of 300 industry colleagues, announcing to the entire award ceremony that he was leaving her to marry her best friend Rachel, the woman who'd been Victoria's maid of honor, her confidant through every struggle, the person she trusted with every secret except one. Marcus's voice cut through the applause as he declared their 12-year marriage over, his arm already wrapped around Rachel's waist, both of them smiling as cameras flashed and gas rippled through the ballroom. But what Marcus didn't know as he publicly humiliated his wife at her greatest professional triumph was that 3 hours earlier, Victoria had received the call from her late grandmother's attorney informing her that she'd inherited $800 million and controlling interest in Monroe Industries, the very company where Marcus had climbed to vice president, the company he thought belonged to distant relatives, the empire he'd spent years trying to impress, never realizing his wife was the hidden heir who'd been quietly working under her mother's maiden name, building her own success without the family name, proving herself independently while he'd been secretly planning his betrayal with Rachel for 18 months. The divorce papers trembled in Victoria's hands as Marcus smirked, telling the shocked audience this was his liberation from a woman who'd never supported his ambitions, from a wife who'd been too focused on her career, from a marriage that had been holding him back, while Rachel's diamond engagement ring caught the light. A ring Victoria recognized as far more expensive than Marcus could afford on his salary. A ring that made her wonder what else she didn't know about their affair, about how long they'd been spending her money, accessing her accounts, planning this public destruction of everything she'd built. But how could Marcus stand there so confident, so cruel, so certain of his victory? What would make a man choose an award ceremony to destroy his wife? And what would happen when Marcus arrived at work Monday morning and discovered the woman he just divorced at her moment of triumph was now his boss, the owner of his career, the holder of his future? Would the shock of learning his ex-wife controlled everything he'd worked for change what he did next? Or would his reaction to discovering Victoria's inheritance and power prove even more stunning than his betrayal? Victoria's fingers traced the divorce papers Marcus had thrust into her hands moments before, the legal text blurring through tears she refused to shed in front of the murmuring crowd. The award ceremony had transformed into something else entirely, a spectacle of public humiliation that felt surreal even as it happened. Marcus stood 15 feet away, his tailored suit the one she'd helped him pick out last month, his confidence radiating as though he'd just won rather than destroyed something. Rachel wouldn't meet her eyes, her former best friend studying the floor with an expression Victoria couldn't quite read, shame or triumph or something else entirely. The ceremony organizers didn't know whether to continue or stop, frozen in a tableau of social disaster, until Victoria made the decision for them. She stepped back to the microphone, her voice steady despite everything crumbling inside. "Thank you for this honor," she said simply, holding up the Architect of the Year trophy. "This award represents 10 years of work on projects that transform communities. I'm grateful to everyone who believed in my vision." She walked off stage with her head high, ignoring the whispers that followed like autumn leaves in her wake. In the ladies' room, Victoria finally allowed herself to breathe. Her phone buzzed with the 100th message since the papers had been served, but she ignored them all except one from her grandmother's attorney, Harrison Webb. "We need to talk immediately. Board meeting scheduled for Monday 9 a.m. Your attendance mandatory as majority shareholder and new CEO of Monroe Industries." CEO. The word felt foreign and familiar at once. Her grandmother Eleanor Monroe had built the manufacturing empire from nothing, a woman who'd survived her husband's death and society's skepticism to create something lasting. Victoria had always known she'd inherit eventually, but Eleanor had been only 73, vibrant and sharp. The heart attack 2 weeks ago had been sudden, shocking, and private. Victoria had requested no public announcement until after the reading of the will, wanting to grieve quietly before the media attention that would inevitably follow. She'd never imagined the inheritance and Marcus's betrayal would collide like this. Never thought she'd learn in the same afternoon that she was both freed from her marriage and thrust into corporate leadership. The timing felt like fate or punishment. She couldn't decide which. Her phone buzzed again, this time from her mother. Coming to get you. Don't speak to anyone. Victoria stared at her reflection, seeing the girl who'd changed her name to Ashford when she started her architecture firm, desperate to succeed without the Monroe name opening or closing doors. She'd wanted to prove herself, to know her achievements were genuinely hers. Now the name she'd hidden from would define everything ahead. The woman in the mirror looked composed, professional, successful, but inside, Victoria felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fall or fly. Marcus had chosen this moment, this triumph, to humiliate her, but he'd picked the wrong day to underestimate his wife. The question wasn't whether she'd survive this, Victoria realized. The question was who she'd become in the process. 12 years earlier, Victoria had met Marcus at a coffee shop near the university, both of them graduate students with dreams bigger than their bank accounts. He'd been charming, ambitious, with plans to climb the corporate ladder at whatever company would have him. She'd been in love with buildings, with the way architecture could change lives, with creating spaces that mattered. They'd bonded over late-night study sessions and shared poverty, eating ramen and believing their futures would be golden. Rachel had been Victoria's roommate then, a psychology student with an easy laugh and genuine warmth. The three of them had been inseparable, a unit against the world. Victoria remembered the exact moment she should have seen the warning signs. 5 years into their marriage, Marcus had complained about her name change for her architecture firm. Why not use Monroe, he'd asked. Think of the doors that would open. She'd explained again about wanting to succeed on merit, but his expression had turned calculating rather than understanding. That's privileged thinking, he'd said. People with family money can afford to pretend they don't have it. But Marcus hadn't known the full truth. Yes, her grandmother was wealthy, but the family had been fractured. Victoria's father had died when she was 8, and her mother Elizabeth had moved them away from Chicago and the Monroe Empire, wanting her daughter to have a normal childhood away from corporate politics and fortune-hunting suitors. They lived comfortably but not lavishly in Seattle, Victoria attending public schools, working part-time jobs, earning scholarships. She'd visited grandmother Eleanor twice a year, wonderful visits filled with stories and wisdom, but they'd kept the connection private. Victoria's mother had reconciled with Eleanor only in the last decade, and even then, they'd maintained the separation. Victoria Ashford lived her own life, built her own career. Only her mother and grandmother knew the inheritance that waited. Rachel had known Victoria had a wealthy grandmother, but she'd believed Victoria exaggerated the distance, the independence. You could ask for help any time, Rachel had said once. Must be nice having that safety net. Victoria had tried to explain it wasn't like that, but Rachel's eyes had held something Victoria hadn't wanted to examine too closely. Envy, perhaps, or resentment. The flashbacks came unbidden now as Victoria sat in her mother's car, driving away from the hotel where her triumph had become trauma. She remembered Rachel's questions about Marcus over the past year, innocent-seeming inquiries. Does Marcus seem happy? And has he mentioned feeling unfulfilled? Victoria had confided her worries that Marcus seemed distant, that he'd been working late constantly, that something felt wrong. Rachel had listened, sympathized, encouraged Victoria to be patient, all while sleeping with her husband. Elizabeth Ashford Monroe drove with the focused intensity she brought to everything, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour, her expression carved from granite. Victoria's mother had built her own success as an attorney, deliberately separate from the Monroe name, teaching her daughter that power meant nothing without integrity. Now she gripped the steering wheel like it was Marcus's neck. Your grandmother would have destroyed him, Elizabeth said finally, breaking the silence. Eleanor always said the true measure of people shows when they think they have power over you. Marcus just revealed everything we need to know. Victoria stared out the window at Boston's glittering skyline. Did you know about him and Rachel? I suspected something. Your grandmother definitely knew. Elizabeth glanced at her daughter. Eleanor hired investigators 3 months ago. She didn't tell you because she wanted proof before breaking your heart. The final report came the day before she died. The betrayal cut deeper. Not that her grandmother had investigated, but that Eleanor had died carrying that knowledge, protecting Victoria one last time. What did she find? Elizabeth pulled into the parking garage of her penthouse. Everything. The affair started 18 months ago. Rachel initiated it. She'd been researching your family, figured out the Monroe connection you'd hidden so well. She told Marcus about the potential inheritance. They've been planning this, timing it, positioning themselves. They have joint accounts, property purchased in Rachel's name, investments made with money they somehow accessed from your accounts. Harrison has the full report. They've been stealing from you, Victoria, systematically. The elevator ride up felt eternal. Victoria's mind raced through financial statements she'd never examined closely, trusting Marcus with their joint accounts, trusting Rachel with passwords when she'd needed someone to handle things during a 3-month project overseas. How much? $200,000 over the past year. Small withdrawals, careful transfers, nothing large enough to trigger alerts. Rachel's a psychologist. She knew how to manipulate both of you. Marcus is weak and ambitious. She promised him your inheritance if they played it right. The public divorce at your award ceremony was meant to humiliate you into a quick settlement. They planned to demand half of everything, including what they thought would be your eventual inheritance. They didn't know Eleanor died. They didn't know the will had already been read. They thought they had time. Inside the penthouse, Victoria collapsed onto the leather sofa. Her entire adult life had been built on lies. Her husband hadn't loved her. Her best friend had been an enemy wearing a mask. Everything she'd believed about her most important relationships was fiction. Harrison needs you to understand something, Elizabeth continued, pouring them both whiskey. Monroe Industries employs 43,000 people. Your grandmother built something real, something that matters. Marcus is vice president of strategic development. Rachel's been consulting for the HR department for 6 months. Another thing you didn't know, another strategic positioning. Your grandmother's board meeting on Monday is about succession, but it's also about protecting the company from internal threats. Eleanor knew what they were planning. She prepared for this. Marcus celebrated with Rachel in the hotel suite they'd secretly maintained for 6 months, the one Victoria's stolen money had funded, toasting with champagne that cost more than he'd ever spent on his wife. The divorce had gone perfectly, exactly as Rachel had scripted it. Victoria's face when he'd handed her those papers in front of everyone, at her big moment, that expression would sustain him for years. She'd looked shattered, small, defeated. Finally, she'd understood how much he'd sacrificed being married to someone so self-absorbed, so focused on her own success. Did you see her hands shaking? Marcus laughed, pouring another glass. 12 years of pretending to support her career, and she never once asked what I needed. She never leveraged her family connections for me. She kept that Monroe name hidden like it was shameful instead of useful. What kind of wife does that? Rachel curled against him, her diamond ring glinting, her smile satisfied. A selfish wife, a woman who didn't deserve you. But that's over now. When the inheritance comes through, when her grandmother finally dies and Victoria gets whatever trust fund is waiting, we'll be positioned perfectly. Community property state, Marcus. You're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, including inheritances. She'll have to give you millions just to get rid of you. And by then, we'll already have established our own accounts, our own investments. She'll never know how much we've already taken. Marcus had been skeptical when Rachel first explained her research into Victoria's family. When she'd revealed that the wealthy grandmother Victoria, rarely mentioned, was actually Eleanor Monroe of Monroe Industries, a manufacturing empire worth billions. He'd felt betrayed that Victoria had hidden such connections, had made him struggle and scrape while she could have opened any door with a phone call. Rachel had understood his anger, validated it, shown him that he deserved better. Monday, I'm pitching the Anderson acquisition to the board, Marcus said. When it goes through, I'll be executive VP, maybe even COO eventually. Victoria doesn't understand corporate politics. She thinks designing buildings makes her important, but real power is in business. She'll be working on her little projects while I'm running an empire. Rachel traced patterns on his chest. Has anyone from Monroe Industries contacted you about Eleanor's death? Any memorial service announcements? Nothing official. She was private, and Victoria's been weird about her family forever. Probably some small funeral somewhere. Victoria's mother will handle it. Marcus stretched, satisfied. The old woman probably left everything to some trust that won't pay out for years. But we've got time. We've planned everything perfectly. They'd planned for everything except the truth. Monday morning arrived with autumn rain against the windows of Monroe Industries headquarters, a 40-story tower of glass and steel that dominated Chicago's skyline. Victoria had flown in Sunday night, spent hours with Harrison Webb reviewing documents, understanding the scope of what her grandmother had built and what she now controlled. The board meeting began at 9, and by 8:55, Victoria sat in the executive conference room, wearing her grandmother's pearls and her own armor of composure. The board members filed in, 12 executives who'd worked with Eleanor for decades, familiar faces from childhood visits Victoria barely remembered. They knew who she was, had watched her grow up from a distance, understood what this transition meant. Harrison made the introductions formally, establishing the legal framework. Victoria Monroe Ashford was now the majority shareholder with 51% of Monroe Industries. Appointed CEO per Eleanor's will, effective immediately. At 9:15, Marcus arrived, coffee in hand, confident smile in place, completely unaware. He took his usual seat halfway down the table, nodding greetings to colleagues, pulling out his tablet to review the Anderson acquisition proposal. He didn't notice the tension in the room, the way eyes kept flickering to Victoria at the head of the table, the way conversation died when he entered. Harrison cleared his throat. Before we begin standard business, we need to address the leadership transition. I'd like to formally introduce your new CEO and majority shareholder, Victoria Monroe Ashford. Marcus looked up slowly, his expression confused. He saw Victoria, registered her position at the head of the table, processed the words he'd just heard. His face went through several transformations: confusion, disbelief, denial, and finally something like horror. The coffee cup slipped from his fingers, spilling dark liquid across the mahogany table that nobody moved to clean. "This is a joke," Marcus said, his voice rough. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" Victoria met his eyes calmly, channeling her grandmother's steel. "I'm here because I own this company. I inherited it from my grandmother, Eleanor Monroe, the woman whose memorial service you didn't attend because you were too busy celebrating our divorce. The woman who built this empire you've been trying to climb. The woman who was my family, Marcus. My blood, my legacy." The room fell silent except for rain against windows. Marcus's face had gone white, then red, then white again. "You never said, you never told me. You let me believe. I let you believe what you chose to believe. I told you I wanted to succeed on my own merit. I told you my family was complicated. I told you the truth, Marcus. You just didn't listen because you were too busy calculating what you could take from me." Victoria's voice remained steady, professional, but her hands gripped the table edge. "Harrison, please present the findings from my grandmother's investigation." Harrison distributed folders to each board member, thick documents detailing 18 months of theft, manipulation, and betrayal. Bank records showing systematic withdrawals from Victoria's accounts. Email trails between Marcus and Rachel discussing strategy. Text messages planning the award ceremony divorce. Evidence of Rachel's research into the Monroe family wealth. Proof of their calculated destruction of Victoria's marriage and finances. "You're fired, Marcus," Victoria said simply. "Security will escort you out. You'll be hearing from our attorneys regarding the theft charges. And the divorce papers you served? I've had them reviewed. You're entitled to nothing. Any community property claims are voided by your fraud and theft. I'm keeping everything. And you're leaving with exactly what you brought into this marriage: ambition and betrayal." Marcus stood frozen as two security guards entered the conference room, professional and implacable. His mind couldn't process the reversal, couldn't accept that Victoria, his wife who'd always been so soft and accommodating, who'd never fought back, who'd taken his criticism and emotional distance without complaint, now held absolute power over his future. The board members watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to pity, but none of them showed surprise. They'd known. All of them had known who Victoria was, what she'd inherit, what Marcus had done. He'd been performing for an audience that already knew the truth of the play. "Wait," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "Victoria, please, we can talk about this. 12 years of marriage means something. I made a mistake. I was confused. Rachel manipulated me. Don't. Victoria's voice cut through his pleading like a blade. Don't insult both of us by lying now. You made calculated choices. You and Rachel spent 18 months planning how to destroy me and take what you thought would be my inheritance. You stole $200,000 from our accounts. You served me divorce papers at my award ceremony to humiliate me into a quick settlement. Every single action was deliberate. Own it, Marcus. At least have that much integrity. The security guards moved closer, their presence a clear message. Marcus felt panic rising, the reality of unemployment and legal charges and public exposure crashing over him. His entire career had been built at Monroe Industries, his reputation, his network. Victoria was erasing him from the only professional life he'd known. I'll sue you, he said desperately. I'll go to the media. I'll tell them you're abusing your power, using your position for revenge. Please do, Victoria replied calmly. I'd love to see you explain to reporters why you're suing the woman you divorced at her award ceremony, the wife you betrayed with her best friend, the person you systematically stole from for 18 months. I'm sure that will generate the sympathy you're hoping for. Harrison, do we have those non-disclosure agreements Marcus signed when he was promoted? Harrison smiled thinly. We do. Very comprehensive NDAs covering all company business, trade secrets, and proprietary information. Any public statements about Monroe Industries or its leadership will constitute breach of contract with additional legal penalties. Mr. Torres is welcome to speak to the media about his personal life, but he cannot discuss anything related to his employment here without facing immediate legal action. Marcus felt the trap closing. Rachel had promised this would work, had assured him that Victoria was weak, that the public humiliation would devastate her into compliance, that they'd extract millions before Victoria even understood what was happening. But Rachel hadn't known about the inheritance timing. Rachel hadn't anticipated Eleanor's death and immediate will execution. Rachel had been wrong about everything, including Victoria's strength. What about Rachel? Marcus asked, grasping at anything. She's a consultant here. You can't fire her without cause. Her contract was terminated this morning for professional misconduct, Harrison said. Dr. Rachel Chen's consulting relationship with Monroe Industries is concluded. She's also being investigated for potential ethics violations regarding her relationship with an employee while providing psychological services to the company. State licensing boards take such conflicts of interest very seriously. The security guards were no longer patient. They positioned themselves on either side of Marcus, ready to escort him out. Victoria stood, gathering her materials, preparing to continue the board meeting without him. Marcus had one final desperate card to play. 3 hours after Marcus's removal from Monroe Industries, Victoria returned to her hotel room exhausted but oddly clear-headed. The board meeting had continued productively once he was gone. Discussions of operations and strategy and growth that made her realize how much her grandmother had prepared her for this role. Those childhood visits had included factory tours and dinner conversations about leadership and responsibility. Eleanor had been teaching her all along, trusting Victoria would eventually need those lessons. The inheritance wasn't just money and control, it was a carefully constructed education in how to lead. Her phone showed 63 missed calls and 200 messages. Media had gotten the story, though she wasn't sure how. Victoria suspected Marcus or Rachel had leaked selectively, trying to control the narrative, painting themselves as victims. But Harrison's team had been faster, providing journalists with the full picture. Eleanor Monroe's death, Victoria's inheritance, Marcus's theft and betrayal. The story was already framing itself as poetic justice. The wronged wife becoming the powerful CEO, the scheming husband losing everything. Victoria's mother arrived with takeout and wine, settling into the hotel suite's small living room with the practicality that defined her. Harrison called. Marcus contacted every media outlet in Boston and Chicago, claiming wrongful termination and abuse of power. Then he made a mistake. What mistake? He went to Rachel. They're holed up in that suite, planning their next move. But Marcus doesn't know that Rachel's been recording their conversations since the beginning. Insurance policy in case things went wrong. She's got everything on tape, including him explicitly discussing the theft, the manipulation, The planned humiliation. Rachel's attorney contacted Harrison an hour ago. She wants immunity from prosecution in exchange for turning over all evidence against Marcus. She's willing to testify that he masterminded everything, that she was coerced, that she's a victim too. Victoria felt sick. The betrayal had layers upon layers, each person willing to destroy the other to save themselves. What did Harrison say? He's considering it. Rachel's testimony would make the case against Marcus ironclad, but it means she potentially walks away from this. Elizabeth studied her daughter. What do you want, Victoria? This is your decision. You can push for charges against both of them, or you can accept Rachel's deal and ensure Marcus faces full consequences. The question hung in the air. Victoria thought about revenge, about justice, about mercy. Her grandmother had always taught that power meant nothing if wielded cruelly, that strength showed in restraint as much as action. But Eleanor had also been ruthless when necessary, protecting her company and employees from threats. I want them both to understand consequences, Victoria said finally, but I don't want to become someone obsessed with punishment. Rachel's life is essentially over regardless. Her professional reputation is destroyed, her licensing under investigation. She'll never work in psychology again. Marcus is the one who vowed to love me, who betrayed that vow deliberately. I want the legal consequences to reflect that distinction. Elizabeth nodded slowly. I'll tell Harrison to accept Rachel's cooperation, but ensure she still faces civil liability for the theft. She doesn't get to walk away clean, but she doesn't get criminal charges. Marcus gets the full weight of everything. The shocking part came 3 days later, when Marcus did something no one anticipated, something that forced Victoria to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about revenge, justice, and what it meant to truly let go of a life that no longer existed. Marcus had spent those 3 days watching his world dismantle with the precision of a controlled demolition. Media coverage was brutal. Rachel had betrayed him with the recordings, and his attorney had delivered the devastating news that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Criminal charges were pending, civil suits from Victoria would leave him bankrupt, and his professional reputation was irreparably destroyed. But instead of fighting or fleeing or continuing to play victim, Marcus appeared at Monroe Industries headquarters on Thursday afternoon and requested a meeting with Victoria. Security called for approval, skeptical and protective, but Victoria agreed. They met in a small conference room with Harrison present as witness and protection, Marcus looking hollowed out and older than his 38 years. He carried no briefcase, no lawyer, no agenda except the truth. I'm not here to apologize, Marcus began, his voice quiet but steady. An apology would be insufficient and insulting given what I've done. I'm here to accept full responsibility and to tell you something you deserve to know. Rachel didn't seduce me. I pursued her. She researched your family, yes, but I asked her to. I knew you had to have connections you weren't sharing, and I resented you for hiding them. I felt entitled to your success, to your opportunities, to everything you'd built without me. The affair wasn't about attraction. It was about punishing you for being better than me. Victoria felt the words land like stones in still water. She'd expected denial or manipulation, not this stark honesty. Marcus continued, his eyes finally meeting hers directly. I destroyed our marriage because I couldn't handle being married to someone more successful, more talented, more fundamentally decent than I was. Every award you won, every project you completed, every client who chose you, it all reminded me that I was mediocre. Rachel told me what I wanted to hear, that you were the problem, that you were selfish for not using your name to help me. But the truth is, I never wanted a partner. I wanted a subordinate. I wanted someone whose success reflected on me instead of overshadowing me. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, but Victoria remained still, letting Marcus finish whatever he'd come to say. I'm going to plead guilty to all charges. I'm going to settle the civil suit by giving you everything I have left, which isn't much but includes the accounts Rachel and I opened with your stolen money. I'm going to issue a public statement taking full responsibility and making it clear that Rachel was manipulated by me, not the other way around. She was weak and opportunistic, but I was the architect of the betrayal. And then I'm leaving Chicago, leaving finance, leaving everything I thought defined me. Marcus stood slowly. You didn't just inherit money and a company, Victoria. You inherited the chance to build something better than what I tried to destroy. Don't let what I did make you bitter. Don't let my choices poison who you become as a leader. That would be my final victory, and I don't deserve one." He walked out without waiting for a response, leaving Victoria sitting in shocked silence. Harrison exhaled slowly. "That was unexpected." Victoria nodded, processing Marcus's words, feeling something shift inside her. The anger and betrayal didn't disappear, but they became something different, something she could carry without being consumed. Marcus's confession had given her something she didn't expect: closure without victory, truth without triumph. He'd shocked them all not by fighting, but by surrendering completely, by choosing honesty over strategy. It didn't erase what he'd done or make it forgivable, but it freed Victoria from the need to keep punishing him. He was already lost, already destroyed by his own choices. She could let him go and move forward into the life her grandmother had entrusted to her, the company that needed her, the future that waited with possibility instead of revenge. Victoria picked up her phone and called her mother. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Let's build something Eleanor would be proud of."